History has a way of feeling far away, almost like a soft dream. When we think about the past, it does not always come alive with battles or rulers or sudden events. Sometimes it feels slow, stretched out over long seasons, over years when little seemed to change. That is the sort of history that rests quietly in the background, the kind that lingers in the ways people lived from one day to the next. It is the sort of history that is not about kings and queens, but about ordinary life, about the people who gathered herbs, whispered words into the night, and kept traditions alive without writing them down. If you close your eyes and let yourself drift, you can imagine it. A village small and quiet set against rolling hills and fields. Houses built of wood and thatch. The smell of smoke from a hearth fire. The sound of a well bucket creaking as it is drawn up. Life was slow, sometimes harsh, and yet threaded with little rituals that gave people comfort. Women were often at the center of this. Their roles in families and communities meant they carried knowledge that others did not always understand. They knew which plants might ease a cough, which leaves might bring down a fever, and which roots could calm the pain of childbirth. To us, this seems like herbal medicine. To them, it was part of daily survival. But to neighbors who did not know where such wisdom came from, it seemed a little mysterious, a little otherworldly. That is how practices began to be seen as witchcraft. Not necessarily the dark, frightening image we picture today, but something softer, quieter, rooted in the rhythms of nature. Picture a woman stepping out into the morning air. The sun has only just risen. She carries a small basket. She knows exactly where to walk, past the hedge wessaw, down by the stream, to find the plant she needs. She bends, touches the soil, cuts the stems carefully, and whispers thanks. Perhaps she believes the spirit of the plant must be honored, or perhaps it is simply the way she was taught by her mother. She ties the herbs in a bundle, sets them in the basket, and carries them home to dry above the hearth. These actions seem ordinary, almost boring, yet in the repetition of them we see the roots of what later became feared as magic. In the evenings, after the work of the day was finished, people gathered around firelight. The flames flickered and shadows danced on the walls. Children listened to stories told by elders. Women sometimes spoke in hushed voices, passing along knowledge of charms. A charm might be nothing more than a rhyme, a few repeated words meant to protect the family or the livestock. It might be a small carved figure kept in a pocket. To an outsider, it might appear strange, but for the people who believed in it, the charm was a comfort. Life was uncertain. Illness struck without warning. Weather could ruin crops. A cow might stop producing milk, or a child might fall sick overnight. In those moments, people turned not only to prayer and church, but also to the women who seemed to know secret things. Their homes smelled of dried herbs, smoke, and honey. They had jars filled with powders, oils, and roots. When someone came to them, they did not turn them away. They prepared a tea or pressed a poultice against a wound or whispered a blessing. For those who received the help, it often felt like hope itself. If you let yourself imagine walking through such a village, you might notice how small details stood out. The sound of a door creaking open, the sight of bundles of lavender hanging from a ceiling beam, the steady motion of a hand grinding seeds with a stone mortar. All of these details create a rhythm. That rhythm is the heartbeat of daily life, a steady pulse that carried people through seasons of uncertainty. To call it witchcraft was, in many ways, to name what was not fully understood. Third, women did not think of themselves as witches, at least not in the early centuries. They thought of themselves as caretakers, healers, mothers, daughters, and neighbors. They passed their skills from one generation to the next. Sometimes the knowledge was practical, based on trial and error. Other times it was wrapped in ritual, where saying the right words or following the right steps mattered just as much as the plants themselves. The rituals gave shape to the practice, turning ordinary healing into something that felt sacred. The church bells rang in the distance, calling people to worship, but the quiet rituals in kitchens and gardens continued as well. There was no sharp divide, not yet. People prayed to God and also trusted the woman down the lane who knew which herb to pick at dawn. The two systems of belief overlapped in ways that seem strange to us now, but were normal then. It was not until later, when suspicion grew, that these everyday acts became dangerous. For now, imagine the slow passing of days. Spring arrives, bringing blossoms and warmth. Women gather nettles for soup and mint for tea. Summer follows, heavy with heat, and herbs are hung to dry in shaded corners. Autumn brings harvest, apples and grains stored carefully, and women prepare jars of preserves flavored with spices. Winter settles in, and families huddle by the hearth. Colds and fevers spread more easily, and once again neighbors turn to the women who know how to ease the coughs, soothe the aches, and bring sleep to restless children. This was witchcraft, not as dark enchantment, but as the steady work of caring for life through every season. Nidhi. If you picture this history long enough, it becomes like a lullaby. Each action is repeated again and again, season after season, generation after generation. The gathering, the drying, the preparing, the whispering of words. A rhythm, slow and gentle, carrying on almost unnoticed. That is the history of witchcraft in its earliest form. Not a tale of fear, but of steady survival, quiet devotion, and a belief in the unseen threads that tied people to the natural world. When we think about witchcraft in the past, it is easy to imagine circles of people under the moon or strange gatherings in the forest. But for most women, witchcraft was quiet, ordinary, and deeply connected to herbs. The garden and the meadow, the field and the forest edge. These were their tools. Every plant had a purpose. Every leaf and flower held some meaning. To walk through the natural world was, in a way, to walk through a library, with pages written not in ink but in roots, petals, and seeds. Herbal knowledge was one of the oldest and most trusted forms of what people would later call magic. If a child had a fever, willow bark could be brewed into a bitter drink. If someone could not sleep, lavender blossoms were placed under the pillow. Chamomile tea was given to calm the stomach, and mint leaves were chewed to freshen the breath. These practices were not mysterious to the women who performed them. They were simple, learned methods, passed from mother to daughter. Yet to those who did not understand the connection between plant and body, it seemed like hidden wisdom, something only special women could know. Imagine the slow process of collecting herbs. A woman would rise early, perhaps before sunrise, when the dew was still clinging to the grass. She would walk barefoot through the fields, the hem of her dress brushing against wet blades. With a careful hand, she would bend to pick each plant, cutting only what was needed. There was often a ritual to it. She might whisper a few words of thanks, or she might avoid speaking at all, believing silence gave the plant more power. Once gathered, the herbs were tied into bundles with string or twine and hung in kitchens, where the warm air from the hearth would slowly dry them. The smell filled the room. Sharp sage, sweet lavender, earthy thyme. Days stretched into weeks, and the herbs cured slowly until they could be stored in jars, ready for use in the cold months ahead. When sickness came, the jars were opened. A spoonful of dried leaves would be placed in boiling water. The steam rose slowly, carrying the fragrance through the room. A child coughing in bed might watch as the cup was carried to them. They drank, bitter at first, but then warmth spread through their chest, and breathing came a little easier. Was this magic? Or was it simply the natural power of plants? To the family, it did not matter. What mattered was that it worked, or at least it felt as though it worked. That feeling of comfort was enough to weave the act into something sacred. But it was not just about healing sickness. Herbs were also used for protection. A sprig of rosemary hung by the door was said to keep evil away. Sage burned in the home cleared away bad energy. Garlic, with its strong scent, was braided and hung in kitchens to ward off illness. These were simple acts, repeated quietly, never meant to cause harm. But in the minds of the people who relied on them, they carried weight. They were charms, small shields against the uncertainty of the world. The women who practiced these things often did not write their knowledge down. They remembered. They repeated. They shared only with those they trusted. Knowledge was fragile, passed mouth to ear, from one generation to the next. This secrecy added to the sense of mystery. To a stranger, it seemed like hidden knowledge. To a neighbor, it was simply tradition. Over time, entire communities became dependent on these women. When crops failed, they turned to them for rituals of protection. When livestock grew sick, they sought special mixtures of herbs and salts. When children cried through the night, they asked for teas and charms to bring calm. Slowly, the women became both respected and feared. Respected for the help they gave, feared for the unseen power they seemed to hold. And think of the rhythm of their days. Rising early, gathering plants, grinding seeds in a mortar, heating mixtures over a small fire, and storing jars on shelves, labeling them with scraps of parchment. The soft sound of hands working leaves into powder, the steady repetition of stirring, pouring, measuring. Each action done without hurry, without excitement, because that was simply life. When seen in this way, history becomes less about great events and more about small details, repeated endlessly. There were superstitions attached to the herbs as well. Some plants were said to work only if gathered at night. Others were believed to hold power only if harvested under a full moon. The timing mattered, not only the plant itself. This turned a simple act of gardening into something ritualistic. A woman walking under the moon to cut herbs might not see herself as performing magic, but her neighbors might. The sight of her silhouette against the night sky could be enough to spark whispers. And so, the boundary between ordinary practice and witchcraft blurred until it could hardly be told apart. While cooking was also tied to witchcraft. A kitchen was not only for preparing food, but for blending herbs, spices, and liquids in ways that felt powerful. A stew simmering on the hearth could hold ingredients meant not only to nourish, but also to heal. Honey mixed with vinegar and herbs was given as a tonic. Bread was baked with seeds thought to protect the family from harm. These acts were simple, but they carried layers of meaning. Eating was survival, but it was also a ritual, a way of shaping life through intention. To think about this now, centuries later, is to realize how slow life once was. Everything took time. Walking to find herbs, waiting for them to dry, preparing them carefully, watching over a pot as it boiled. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was instant. The patience of it all adds to the dreamlike quality of the history. To imagine it is to imagine a life where time moved differently, stretched out in long, steady rhythms. So much of what we call witchcraft began in this way. Not in fear, not in secrecy, not in rebellion, but in the slow, daily work of women who simply wanted to help their families and neighbors. They did not claim great power. They did not declare themselves witches. They worked quietly, gathering, drying, storing, and sharing over and over again. Their witchcraft was not lightning and thunder, but candlelight and whispering. It was not storms and shadows, but herbs tied in bundles, hung carefully to dry. The history of witchcraft, when told this way, feels less like a story of danger and more like a story of care. And care, repeated for generations, can feel like magic. Perhaps that is why people believed so strongly in it. The herbs, the teas, the charms, each one a small act, simple enough to be overlooked, yet powerful enough to be remembered centuries later. Beyond herbs and remedies, there were rituals, small and ordinary, woven into daily life. These rituals were not grand ceremonies with drums and chanting. They were quiet, almost invisible acts. A line drawn in the dirt at a doorway, a charm whispered under the breath, a candle lit for no reason other than to keep watch through the night. These were the soft, repetitive gestures that people carried with them, the gestures that gave shape to their days and reassurance to their nights. And For women, such rituals often began at home. A mother might place a sprig of dried lavender beneath her child's pillow to keep away bad dreams. A wife might scatter salt across the threshold to guard against unwelcome visitors. A daughter might tie a ribbon around her wrist, believing it would protect her on long walks through the forest. None of these things were loud or dramatic. They were personal, private, and gentle, yet their presence lingered in every corner of life. Consider the act of whispering words over water. A woman would fill a pot, set it on the fire, and watch as steam curled upward. Before adding herbs or grains, she might bend low and speak softly. The words were simple, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a hope, sometimes nothing more than a rhyme learned long ago. The belief was that the steam carried her voice to the unseen world, delivering her request beyond the walls of the kitchen. The water boiled, the meal was cooked, and life went on. But in the act of whispering, she had marked the moment with intention, and that was enough to make it feel meaningful. Symbols played their part as well. Across many villages, people scratched shapes into wooden doors, carved patterns into tools, or pressed signs into bread dough before baking it. The shapes were often simple: a cross, a circle, a star. They were not meant as decoration, but as protection. A mark on a doorway told passing spirits to keep away. A mark on bread promised health to the family who ate it. These symbols became part of the rhythm of work, so ordinary that people hardly noticed them, yet powerful enough to survive for centuries in memory. Fire and light also held a place in these rituals. In the evening, when the day's labor was done, candles were lit. To us, this seems ordinary. To them, light itself was sacred. Darkness held unknown dangers. Shadows carried fears. A small flame was more than warmth. It was a shield, a comfort, a steady presence in the silence of night. Sometimes candles were lit not for light, but for blessing. A candle placed in the window might guide a traveler home. A candle burned beside a bed might keep illness at bay. Each flicker of flame carried meaning. The moon, too, was important. Its phases marked the rhythm of life. Some women believed that gathering herbs under the full moon gave them greater strength. Others planned their rituals around its light, setting jars of water outside to absorb what they thought of as lunar power. At night, the sight of the moon hanging above the village carried mystery. It was steady, silent, and unchanging, watching as generations passed. To work by its glow was to feel part of something larger, something timeless. Protection of the home was another focus of ritual. The hearth, where fire burned day and night, was seen as the heart of the household. Women often performed small acts to guard it, sprinkling herbs near the fire, hanging iron tools above the hearth to keep away harm, sweeping the floor in a particular way, believing the motion carried out not only dust, but also misfortune. These gestures were small, but repeated so often that they shaped how people lived within their homes. Rituals also extended into the seasons. In spring, women might scatter seeds while murmuring blessings for a good harvest. In summer, they might weave flowers into garlands and hang them in doorways. In autumn, they preserved food with careful thought, adding herbs not only for flavor but for protection. In winter, they burned special woods in the fire, believing the smoke would drive away illness. Each season had its own rhythm, and the rituals gave those rhythms meaning. Sometimes these practices came together in festivals. On certain nights, villages gathered to mark turning points of the year. Fires were lit high on hills, circles were danced, and songs were sung. Women often played an important part, carrying herbs, offering charms, and leading small rituals within the larger celebration. The festivals were not only times of joy, but also times of reassurance, reminding people that they were part of a cycle greater than themselves. What seems striking now is how ordinary these acts were. To the women who practiced them, they were no more unusual than cooking or cleaning. To outsiders, however, They could look mysterious. A neighbor who saw a woman tying herbs to her doorway at night might whisper that she was calling on unseen forces. A passerby who heard soft words spoken into the wind might wonder if she was casting a spell. Slowly, over time, these misunderstandings built into suspicion. But in their beginnings, the rituals were simple acts of comfort, woven into daily life like threads in cloth. If we pause and imagine one of these homes, the details appear clearly. A wooden table, worn smooth by years of use. A clay pot filled with water resting on the hearth. Bundles of herbs hanging in the corner, their shadows long in the firelight. A single candle flickering against the wall. A woman moving slowly, quietly, her hands practiced in their motions. She sprinkles a pinch of salt, whispers a few words, and continues with her work. Nothing about it feels frightening, nothing feels dramatic. It is slow, careful, and calm. And yet, for those who lived in such times, there was a sense that the world was filled with forces unseen. Illness could strike without warning. Storms could ruin months of labor. Livestock could sicken, or crops could wither. These mysteries needed explanation, and so the rituals provided it. They gave people a sense of control, a belief that they were not helpless. Lighting a candle, scattering herbs, whispering words, all of it was a way of shaping the world, even if only in their minds. The history of witchcraft is often told as if it were filled with fear and danger. But before fear took hold, it was a history of rituals like these. Soft, ordinary, calming rituals. They were not meant to harm. They were meant to protect, to comfort, and to connect people to something larger than themselves. To think of them now is to realize how much of life was shaped by such small gestures. And in the repetition of those gestures, generation after generation, history itself was formed. In villages across Europe and beyond, there were always women who stood out quietly, not because they were loud or powerful, but because others turned to them in times of need. They were often called wise women, healers, or midwives. Their knowledge seemed deep, as if they carried answers hidden from everyone else. These women were at the center of communities, though they rarely sought attention. Their work was not about prestige. It was about being useful, about offering comfort when little else could be done. A wise woman's home was rarely empty. Neighbors came with questions, with aches, with worries. A mother might arrive, carrying a restless child in her arms, hoping for something to calm the cough. A farmer might knock on the door, explaining that his cow was not producing milk, asking if she had a remedy. A young woman might come quietly, embarrassed, looking for help with matters she could not speak of in public. The wise woman listened. She nodded. She did not promise miracles, but she offered herbs, teas, small charms, and words of reassurance. People left with something in their hands, but more importantly, with hope in their hearts. Her knowledge stretched across many areas of life. In childbirth, she was often the one who guided mothers through the long hours, calming them, speaking softly, and using whatever skills she had to ease the pain. In sickness, she prepared remedies that soothed. In grief, she was the one who listened, who placed a hand on a shoulder, who lit a candle and murmured a blessing. These women knew that healing was not always about curing. Sometimes it was simply about being present, about reminding people that they were not alone. If you imagine the space she lived in, you might see shelves lined with jars, each one filled with something different. Dried leaves, powdered roots, small bundles of flowers. There might be animal bones, not as frightening relics, but as tools used in measuring or grinding. The air smelled of smoke, herbs, and earth. Light entered through small windows, landing softly on the wooden table where she worked. Her tools were simple: mortar and pestle, cloths for straining, pots for boiling. Nothing was extraordinary, yet in the way she used them, they became powerful. The respect given to these women was real. Villagers knew who to call in times of difficulty. Their role was woven into the life of the community. But alongside respect, there was always a shadow of unease. To trust someone so much meant also to fear what might happen if they turned their skills another way. If she could heal, could she also harm? If her words could soothe, could they also curse? These quiet doubts lingered, unspoken, but they grew stronger with time. Despite this, the wise women endured. They continued their work, not because they wanted influence, but because people needed them. In places where doctors were rare or too expensive, they were the only source of care. Their remedies were not always perfect, but they were better than nothing. A woman who had seen dozens of births knew more than most about how to help a laboring mother. A woman who had gathered herbs since childhood knew more than most about what eased pain or fever. Her knowledge was lived, tested in the small details of everyday life. What made these women remarkable was not only their knowledge, but also their ability to weave it into community life. They did not separate themselves. They were part of the same rhythms as everyone else, working in the fields, raising children, tending homes. Their wisdom was not kept in books. It was lived out in daily acts, repeated again and again. That made it accessible, but it also made it fragile. If a woman died without passing her knowledge on, much of it vanished with her. Perhaps this is why so many rituals and remedies feel mysterious to us now. They were not written down. They were carried in memory, and memory fades. Even so, fragments remain in stories and in folklore. We hear of women who knew how to make poultices from clay and herbs, who could stop bleeding with pressure and words, who tied protective charms to cradles so babies would sleep. We hear of women who spoke quietly to animals, who seemed to sense storms before they came, who could look into the fire and give advice. Whether all of this was true or not, it tells us how people saw them. They were figures of reassurance, guides in uncertain times. If you pause and picture one of these women, you might imagine her moving through her day slowly. She rises at dawn, fetches water from the well, tends to her own children, then greets the first visitor at her door. She listens more than she speaks. She reaches for jars, measures powders, stirs mixtures with steady hands. She offers what she can, then returns to her own tasks. There is no rush, no sense of spectacle. Her power lies in patience and presence. This rhythm of care created bonds within the community. People trusted her because she had always been there, through birth, through sickness, through harvest, through death. Her wisdom became part of the village's collective memory. Even those who whispered doubts about her still sought her help when desperation struck. She was both ordinary and extraordinary, both neighbor and healer. That dual role made her indispensable, but it also made her vulnerable. Over time, suspicion would turn against these women. Their knowledge, once valued, would be questioned. Their presence, once reassuring, would be feared. But in the long centuries before fear took over, they were simply part of life. The wise woman, the healer, the midwife, these were not strangers or outcasts. They were daughters, mothers, friends, and neighbors. Their witchcraft, if it can be called that, was nothing more than the slow accumulation of experience, passed quietly through the years. To think of them now is to feel a kind of calm respect. Their work was not loud or violent. It was not the stuff of dramatic stories. It was the soft, repetitive work of keeping communities alive. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered blessing, a spoonful of bitter tea, a candle lit at the bedside. These were their spells, their charms, their magic, and for the people who lived then, that was enough. For many centuries, the knowledge of women healers existed quietly, side by side with church teachings and everyday life. But slowly, suspicion began to rise. What once felt comforting began to feel uncertain. The same rituals that once gave reassurance were now looked at with narrowed eyes. A woman whispering words over boiling water was no longer simply blessing her household. She was possibly speaking to forces unseen, forces that authorities warned against. Fear crept in like a shadow, steady and patient. The medieval church, with its growing influence, wanted to guide every aspect of life. Faith was meant to be practiced in specific ways, within the walls of the church, under the guidance of priests. But the rituals of women healers existed outside of that control. They were done in kitchens, in gardens, in the quiet of night. For some, this independence was troubling. If prayers were to be directed only to God, then what did it mean when a woman whispered charms to the moon? If healing came only through divine blessing, what did it mean when herbs and poultices brought relief? The questions did not lead immediately to accusations, but they stirred a sense of unease that never fully left. Accusations often began with something small. A cow fell ill. A harvest failed. A child grew sick and did not recover. These events were not uncommon in the fragile world of medieval life. But people wanted reasons. When no explanation could be found, suspicion often turned toward the woman who had knowledge others did not. Perhaps she had cursed the cow. Perhaps she had ruined the harvest. Perhaps her remedies had done more harm than good. Fear turned uncertainty into blame. Superstition grew stronger as stories spread from one village to another. Rumors did not need proof. They only needed repetition. A woman seen gathering herbs at night might be called strange. If a storm came the next day, some might whisper that she had caused it. If two neighbors quarreled, and one soon after fell ill, the other might accuse her of witchcraft. The suspicion was rarely about evidence. It was about fear, about the need to make sense of what could not be controlled. The appearance of women added to the suspicion. Those who lived alone, without husbands or families, were seen as unusual. Independence was threatening in a world where most women were tied to households. A woman who lived at the edge of the village with only her herbs and her solitude seemed mysterious. Her independence became a mark against her. If she kept a cat for company, it was no longer just a pet. It was a familiar spirit, a sign that she consorted with dark forces. Even midwives, who played one of the most important roles in villages, were not safe from suspicion. They brought life into the world, guided mothers through the pain of childbirth, and cared for infants in their first fragile days. Yet when mothers or babies died, which often happened at a time without modern medicine, blame sometimes fell on the midwife. Her knowledge, once valued, was now feared. People wondered if her hands, instead of helping, had harmed. It was during this period that the word witch began to take on its darker meaning. A witch was not simply a woman with knowledge. She was a danger. She was someone who could curse fields, summon storms, and harm children. The stories painted her as frightening, though in reality, many of the women accused were simply those who had lived quietly, doing what they had always done. But stories have power. They shape how people think, and the stories of witches spread faster than the truth of wise women. Authorities began to take notice. The church issued warnings. Books were written, filled with instructions on how to identify and prosecute witches. Trials began in some places, though slowly at first. At the village level, suspicion turned into formal accusation. A woman might be called to explain herself, to answer for the herbs she kept or the rituals she performed. Sometimes she was forced to confess, not because she had done wrong, but because fear and pressure left her no choice. The process of suspicion was slow, almost mechanical. A rumor grew into a whisper into a story into an accusation. Each step moved carefully, yet inevitably, toward fear. And once suspicion took hold, it was difficult to shake off. Even if a woman was declared innocent, the shadow of doubt often followed her. Neighbors remembered. Whispers lingered. Trust was never fully restored. Then, despite this, many women continued their practices quietly. They did not see themselves as witches. They were still healers, midwives, and neighbors. They continued to gather herbs, whisper blessings, and light candles, but they did so more carefully, watching over their shoulders, knowing that what once brought respect might now bring danger. This shift in perception shows how fragile trust can be. For centuries, these women had been pillars of their communities. Yet with the spread of fear, they were recast as threats. The same hands that had delivered babies were now said to work with dark forces. The same herbs that had cured fevers were now called poison. Nothing about the women themselves had changed. It was the way people looked at them that transformed. If we imagine life in a village during this time, we can picture the unease. Neighbors still visited the healer's home, but with hesitation. They accepted remedies, but they might cross themselves afterward, just in case. They asked for charms, but they spoke of them quietly, not wanting others to hear. The relationship between healer and community became strained, filled with gratitude and suspicion at once. A woman could be valued one day and feared the next, her reputation shifting like the wind. This was the beginning of the long history of witch trials that would sweep across Europe in the centuries to come. But at first, it was not about courts and executions. It was about whispers, rumors, and slow, creeping fear. It was about the way a glance, a word, or a simple action could be twisted into something sinister. The shift was gradual, almost unnoticed at first, but it changed the course of history for women who had once been trusted. When we tell the story slowly, step by step, it feels less like a sudden explosion of fear and more like a shadow growing longer at dusk. At first, it is barely noticed. Then it stretches across the ground until everything is covered. That was how suspicion spread, calm, steady, and relentless. And in its path, women who had once been seen as wise and helpful became marked as witches. Their lives forever changed. Yet, when fear took deeper root, the quiet suspicions of villages grew into formal accusations, and from accusations came trials. The witch trials are remembered as moments of great drama, yet when we look closely, they unfolded with a kind of slow, bureaucratic rhythm. They were not always fiery spectacles. More often, they were long, drawn-out processes, filled with questions, documents, and the same rituals of authority repeated over and over again. In this way, even the darkest parts of history moved at a pace that feels heavy and almost monotonous. A woman accused of witchcraft was often brought before local leaders. She might stand in a dim room before a group of men who asked her questions in low, steady voices. The questions were simple at first. Did she own herbs? Did she whisper charms? Did she keep an animal, a cat, a dog, or even a bird that stayed near her home? Each answer was written down carefully, ink pressed onto paper. What might have seemed like ordinary details, keeping rosemary, speaking softly over water, having a pet, were recorded as signs of guilt. The trials were built on repetition. Again and again, women were asked the same questions. Again and again, the same stories were told. Neighbors repeated rumors they had heard. A child might say they saw her walking alone at night. Another might claim they felt unwell after speaking with her. Each testimony was added to the pile, and the weight of repetition made it difficult to resist. It was not one accusation, but many small ones, collected until they seemed impossible to deny. Confessions were often demanded. Some women confessed quickly, not because they were guilty, but because they were tired, frightened, and desperate to end the questioning. Others held firm, denying the charges, only to find themselves questioned even longer, until exhaustion wore them down. In some places, harsher measures were used to extract confessions. But even where that was not the case, the endless cycle of questions and suspicion was enough to break anyone's resolve. Once a confession was made, it often followed the same pattern. A woman admitted, sometimes reluctantly, to speaking with spirits, to making pacts, to cursing neighbors. The words were shaped not only by her own voice, but by the expectations of the interrogators. They wanted certain stories, and so the women gave them. The confessions were written down in detail, added to records that would later be read by others, spreading the image of witches farther and wider. The punishments varied. In some places, women were banished from their villages, forced to leave the communities they had served for years. In other places, harsher sentences were carried out. But even before the final judgment, the damage was done. A woman accused of witchcraft rarely returned to the life she had before. Suspicion lingered like a stain. Trust was broken. She was never seen the same way again. What strikes us now is how similar these trials were, no matter where they happened. The questions, the suspicions, the confessions, they repeated across villages, towns, and entire regions. It was as though fear itself had a script, one that communities followed again and again. The rhythm of accusation, interrogation, and punishment became part of the culture, spreading slowly but steadily, shaping the way people thought about women, about knowledge, and about power. And yet, within this heavy process, life went on. Outside the trial rooms, fields were still tended, bread was still baked, children still played in the streets. The rhythm of daily life continued, even as suspicion moved quietly in the background. History often feels this way. Dramatic events unfolding alongside the ordinary, the extraordinary, and the everyday existing side by side. Whereas, the trials remind us that fear does not need sudden explosions to change the world. It can work gradually, step by step, in the slow accumulation of suspicion and repetition. Each trial was one more drop in a bucket, and over time, the bucket filled. Whole regions came to believe in the presence of witches, not because of one moment of proof, but because of countless small accusations, countless confessions written down, countless stories told around hearths. The repetition was its own form of persuasion. If we picture a trial in progress, it is not loud or fiery. It is quiet, methodical, almost tedious. A scribe dips his pen into ink, writes carefully. A judge asks a question, waits for an answer, asks it again in a slightly different way. A neighbor speaks, repeating something they heard weeks before. The woman accused sits, weary, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. Hours pass slowly, filled with the same motions again and again. The scene is less dramatic than we imagine, but in its repetition lies its power. The fear of witches was not limited to one country or one time. It spread across Europe, then across the seas to the colonies of the New World. The same patterns unfolded there as well. Accusations, trials, confessions, different places, different languages, but the same slow rhythm of fear. The stories traveled farther than the women themselves ever could, carried in books, sermons, and whispered tales. Over time, the witch trials grew larger, more organized, but at their heart, they remained rooted in the same suspicion that had begun centuries earlier. The fear of women who carried knowledge outside the control of authority. The trials did not erase that knowledge. They did not end herbal remedies, charms, or rituals, but they pushed them into the shadows, forcing women to practice more quietly, to pass their wisdom more carefully, hidden from watchful eyes. The witch trials are remembered as moments of cruelty, but when told slowly, they also reveal the monotony of fear. They show us how suspicion becomes routine, how fear becomes ordinary. The trials were not exceptional events that stood apart from life. They were woven into it, repeated again and again, until they became part of the landscape of history. To think about them now, in the quiet of reflection, is to realize how much of history is shaped not by sudden change, but by slow, steady repetition. A whisper becomes a story becomes an accusation becomes a trial. And with each repetition, fear grows stronger, until it feels like truth. That is the rhythm of the witch trials, a rhythm that lulled entire communities into believing what they could not see, into fearing the very women who had once been their helpers and healers. The story of women and witchcraft is often told as though it belonged only to Europe, tied to its villages, its churches, and its long winters. But if we look more closely, We see that traditions of magic, healing, and ritual appeared everywhere in many different forms across many different cultures. The word witch may not have been used in the same way, but the ideas were there. Women who carried special knowledge, women who whispered charms, women who acted as bridges between the visible and the unseen. In ancient Egypt, amulets were worn for protection. Small figures shaped from stone or metal were carried on the body, or placed in tombs to keep the dead safe in the afterlife. Women often took part in making or blessing these amulets. Some were in the shape of the eye, watching and guarding. Others took the form of animals, chosen for their strength or wisdom. To us, these look like decorations. But for those who lived then, they were symbols of power. They were small shields against misfortune, carried quietly, day after day. And in Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago, rituals were written into clay tablets. Some were spells to heal the sick, others to ward off evil spirits. Women took part in these rituals, mixing herbs, burning incense, chanting words. The rituals were steady, methodical, and full of repetition. The same gestures performed again and again. Just as in Europe centuries later, the rhythm itself was part of the power. Repetition made the act feel certain, even if the outcome was uncertain. In Africa, traditions of healing and ritual have deep roots. Women there often served as diviners, herbalists, or spiritual guides. They gathered plants from forests and savannas, mixing them into remedies. They used drums, dance, and chanting to connect with spirits. These acts, though different in form, carried the same sense of care and survival. Communities turned to women for healing, for protection, for guidance. Their wisdom was trusted, though sometimes feared, just as it was in Europe. In Asia, too, we see these traditions. In China, women practiced forms of folk healing alongside established medicine. They used acupuncture, herbs, and charms to balance the body's energy. In Japan, stories were told of women who could summon spirits or bring misfortune if angered. These stories remind us that the line between respect and fear was thin everywhere. Women who carried knowledge were valued, but also watched carefully, as though their closeness to the unseen made them both necessary and dangerous. And the Middle East carried its own traditions as well. In villages across the region, women prepared protective charms against the evil eye. Blue beads, intricate knots, whispered blessings. All of these were ways of pushing back against unseen forces. Women blessed newborns, prepared mixtures for the sick, and offered prayers during difficult times. Just as in Europe, much of this was ordinary life, woven into the rhythm of seasons, yet it carried the weight of belief. What connects these many places is not the exact rituals, but the roles women held. They were caretakers, healers, protectors. They worked with what was available: plants, stones, words, fire. They lived close to the rhythms of nature, noticing patterns others might miss. In this way, they became figures of both trust and mystery. Communities relied on them, but also wondered at them. Their wisdom was needed, but also never fully understood. That balance of need and suspicion seems to be part of human history everywhere. Then, even in the Americas, long before European colonists arrived, women played similar roles. Among many indigenous peoples, women acted as medicine keepers, knowing which plants healed, which rituals protected, which songs calmed. Their knowledge was tied not only to health, but to the land itself, to rivers, forests, mountains, and animals. The rituals were not separate from daily life. They were life, woven into every task, every season. And when Europeans later brought their fears of witchcraft across the ocean, these traditions collided. Colonists often misunderstood or feared the practices of indigenous women, labeling them as sorcery or devil's work. Yet the same colonists still carried their own herbal remedies, their own charms, their own quiet rituals. Fear of witchcraft was not about whether such practices existed. They were everywhere. It was about who was allowed to practice them and under whose control. If we pause and look at this global view, we see a pattern. Across cultures, women carried knowledge of herbs, rituals, and unseen forces. Across cultures, they were respected and relied upon. And across cultures, they were also watched with suspicion, sometimes celebrated, sometimes punished. This rhythm of respect and fear moved like a tide, rising and falling in different places and times. It is easy to imagine one of these women, no matter the culture. She moves slowly through the day, gathering plants, mixing remedies, speaking soft words. Her neighbors come to her, bringing their worries. She listens, she offers what she can. Around her, stories begin to grow. Some tell of her kindness, others of her strange power. Over time, the stories blur together until she is no longer just a woman, but a figure of legend, remembered as a witch, a healer, a guide. Nuts. The global story of witchcraft reminds us that this was never just about Europe, never just about one set of trials or fears. It was about something deeper, something human. It was about the way people looked for meaning in a world filled with uncertainty. It was about the way women, so often responsible for care, carried that meaning in rituals, remedies, and words. It was about the tension between needing their wisdom and fearing the mystery of it. Told slowly, this history feels less like a story of fear and more like a story of connection. Different cultures, different rituals, but the same steady rhythm of care. Women whispering blessings. Women tying charms. Women gathering plants beneath the sun or moon. These gestures, repeated across centuries and continents, form a kind of quiet thread through human history. A thread that reminds us how much of life was shaped not by kings or battles, but by small, ordinary acts of care. Witchcraft, in its many quiet forms, was not only about healing or ritual. For many women, it was also about survival. Life in past centuries was fragile. Food could be scarce, winters long, sickness unpredictable. Women carried much of the burden of holding families and communities together, and the practices we call witchcraft were ways of making that burden lighter. They were small strategies for living, small defenses against a world that could often feel harsh and uncertain. Themed. To pass knowledge from mother to daughter was, in many ways, to pass on a tool for survival. A mother might teach her daughter which plants to gather when fever struck, or how to weave protective knots into clothing before a long journey. These lessons were more than superstition. They were ways of preparing the next generation to face the same difficulties she had faced. When words were whispered over herbs, or charms tied above doors, they were not only gestures of faith, they were gestures of protection, the kind of protection that gave people the strength to endure. The secrecy of witchcraft also became part of survival. In a time when suspicion grew quickly, women learned to keep their knowledge quiet, to share it only with those they trusted. A recipe for a healing tea might be disguised as a cooking recipe. A ritual might be blended into daily chores, so it looked like nothing more than sweeping or cooking. These hidden practices allowed traditions to endure, even when openly practicing them became dangerous. Survival was not only about food and shelter, it was about keeping knowledge alive, carried carefully like an ember hidden in the hand. For some women, witchcraft also became a form of identity. In communities where most roles were clearly defined, farmers, blacksmiths, servants, the woman who carried special knowledge was set apart. She was recognized, if not always celebrated. People might not have called her a witch at first, but they knew she was different. Her identity was bound to her remedies, her rituals, her wisdom. Over time, stories built around her, shaping her into something larger than life. Folklore often preserved this identity, even when records did not. Villages remembered the women who seemed to know when storms were coming, or who could ease pain with a touch. Their names might fade, but their roles did not. They became part of local legends, spoken of in hushed voices. In some stories, they were remembered kindly, as healers who brought comfort. In others, they were remembered with fear as witches who carried hidden power. Either way, their identity endured beyond their lifetimes. Witchcraft was also tied to resilience. In a world where women had few formal rights, where their voices were often dismissed, the practices of healing and ritual gave them a kind of power. It was not official power, not written in laws or recognized by leaders, but it was power all the same. To be the person neighbors turned to in moments of need was to hold influence. To know secrets others did not was to carry a form of authority. This resilience, born of necessity, became part of women's identity, even if it was later twisted into suspicion. Think of a woman who had faced hardship. Perhaps she had lost children to illness or endured harsh winters with little food. Her survival depended on resourcefulness. She learned to stretch what she had, to find meaning in small acts, to rely on rituals for comfort when little else was certain. Over time, those acts became habits, and those habits became what others called magic. But for her, they were simply the tools of survival. The rhythm of this survival was steady. Day after day, season after season, women repeated the same acts, gathering herbs, whispering blessings, preparing mixtures, lighting candles. The acts themselves did not change much, but the meaning grew. With each repetition, they reinforced identity. They told women who they were: caretakers, healers, protectors. In a world that often gave them little recognition, witchcraft gave them a sense of self. Set. It is important to remember that witchcraft was not always about fear or accusation. For many, it was about continuity. It was about knowing that the knowledge of grandmothers lived on in daughters. It was about feeling connected to generations before and to the natural world around them. This continuity was its own form of strength, weaving individuals into something larger than themselves. Tassi. When we picture this history slowly, we can almost feel the quiet determination of these women. A woman stirs a pot, not only to feed her family, but to preserve a ritual passed down for centuries. Another woman ties herbs above her doorway, not only to protect her household, but to remind herself of her place in the chain of tradition. Each act was both practical and symbolic, a way of saying, I am here, I endure, I remember. The suspicion of witchcraft did not erase this identity. Even when women were accused, even when rituals were forced into secrecy, the knowledge did not vanish. It shifted, adapted, found quieter ways to survive. And in that adaptation, identity endured. Witchcraft became a way of holding on to power, even in the smallest of forms. It was never only about herbs or charms. It was about survival, resilience, and belonging. Seen from this angle, the story of witchcraft is not only about fear, but also about strength. It is about how women shaped their lives in a world that often tried to shape them instead. It is about how small rituals, repeated over centuries, became threads of identity strong enough to survive suspicion, persecution, and time itself. And when we think of it now, in the quiet of reflection, it feels less like a tale of darkness and more like a tale of persistence. A story of women who carried knowledge through hardship, who survived by weaving meaning into daily life, and who left behind a legacy that continues to whisper through history, steady and calm, like the soft turning of the seasons. When we reach the end of this long history, it is not the fear or the accusations that stay with us most strongly. It is the quiet details, the smell of herbs drying in a kitchen, the soft flicker of a candle in the dark, the steady rhythm of hands grinding seeds in a mortar. These small, ordinary moments are what carried witchcraft through centuries, long before the word itself became heavy with suspicion. Witchcraft, in its earliest forms, was not about grand gestures or terrible power. It was about care. It was about women finding ways to soothe a fever, to ease a cough, to protect a child from bad dreams. It was about neighbors trusting one another, turning to the woman who seemed to know more than the rest, and leaving her home with a little more hope than they had before. These small acts, repeated endlessly, are what shaped the memory of witchcraft. Even when fear grew, even when suspicion spread, The rituals did not disappear. They lived quietly in the background, hidden in kitchens, folded into daily chores, whispered at night. The women who practiced them did not stop. They adapted, they remembered. They passed their knowledge on. In this way, witchcraft was not destroyed by trials or accusations. It endured, woven into the fabric of life, too ordinary and too necessary to vanish completely. Across cultures, across continents, the same patterns can be found. Women gathering herbs, women tying charms, women whispering words of blessing or protection. Different languages, different rituals, but the same human need to bring comfort in uncertain times. The story of witchcraft is not just a European story. It is a human story, repeated in many places, shaped by the same fears, the same hopes, the same rhythms of survival. C'est ça. If we think of history as a great rushing river, then witchcraft is one of the smaller streams running alongside it, steady and persistent. It may not always be noticed, but it never truly disappears. It winds its way through the centuries, carrying with it the memory of women who lived quietly, who cared for others, who found meaning in rituals that gave them strength. In this quiet telling, witchcraft becomes less about fear and more about endurance. It becomes a reminder of how ordinary acts, lighting a candle, hanging a sprig of rosemary, whispering a blessing, can hold extraordinary meaning. It shows us that history is not only shaped by kings, battles, or laws, but also by the patient work of women whose names are mostly forgotten, yet whose actions touched countless lives. And so, as we let the story settle, we return to the small, steady images that began it. A woman stepping into the morning air, carrying a basket, the sound of her footsteps in the grass, the dew wetting her shoes. She bends to cut herbs, her hands careful, her motions slow. She ties the stems together with twine, lifts the basket, and walks home. Later, in the quiet of her kitchen, she hangs the herbs to dry. The air fills with their fragrance. A child sleeps nearby. A candle flickers on the table. Life continues. This is the rhythm that carried on, year after year, generation after generation. A rhythm so steady that it feels almost like a lullaby. The gathering, the drying, the whispering, the blessing. Each act ordinary, yet each act carrying the weight of hope. In the end, this is what witchcraft was for most women. Not power over others, not fear, but comfort, care, and continuity. And as you think of this history now, perhaps you can let its rhythm calm you. Imagine the stillness of the old village, the sound of wind through the fields, the soft light of the moon overhead. Imagine the steady, careful movements of women at work, doing what they had always done. Imagine the small rituals, the whispered words, the quiet strength that held families and communities together. The story of witchcraft is not only about the past, it is also about the human need for meaning, for comfort, for connection. It is about how small actions can carry great weight, how traditions endure even in secrecy, how identity can survive even through fear. It is about the power of the ordinary, repeated until it becomes extraordinary. And now, as we close this long reflection, the story settles into silence. The candles burn low. The herbs hang quietly in the air. The village is at rest, and the women, too, rest after their long days of work. Their knowledge lingers, their rituals remain, carried through time in memory and story. And in the quiet of that memory, there is peace.